You've done the work, so why are you still standing at the door? You weren't supposed to find this today, not by accident, not by algorithm. Something in you reached for it, that quiet, persistent part of you that has always known there's a version of your life that's been patiently assembling itself, waiting for you to stop hesitating at the door. You've sensed it, maybe for months, maybe for years. This awareness that something fuller, something truer, something with actual weight and texture is positioned just beyond where you currently stand. Not far, devastatingly close. You keep almost touching it. You reach, and something pulls you back. And you can't always name what that force is, but it arrives with eerie precision every single time. The moment you get close to the life you've been building toward, something reaches up and grabs your ankle. Carl Jung spent the majority of his career seated across from people in exactly this position. Not broken people, not people who had given up. People who had done the real interior work. People who had descended into their own shadows, faced the grief of their outdated selves, dismantled the inherited structures that kept them compressed. People who were, by every psychological standard, prepared for an expanded life. And yet they remained frozen at the threshold. Something without a name held them in place. Jung became consumed with understanding what that something was. Because whatever it was costing people the very lives their suffering was supposed to have earned them. What he found. What he discovered was not a complex diagnosis. It was a single, undelivered message. A truth residing in the body of every person who has completed the real psychological labor, but hasn't yet stepped into the life that labor was always pointing toward. A truth so fundamental, it sounds like almost nothing when you first hear it. But Jung watched this single realization move people from years of arrested stillness into lives they barely recognized. He watched it function like a key in a lock that everyone had been trying to force open with increasingly intricate instruments. Today, we're going to give you that message, the way Jung understood it. We're going to show you why you've been suspended at the edge of the life you've been building toward, what is actually anchoring you there, and what shifts, sometimes within a single night, when this particular truth finally settles somewhere deeper than your thinking mind. The pattern Jung kept encountering. Someone would arrive in his practice, cracked open by life. A relationship that had collapsed their entire sense of self. A vocation that had gradually emptied them. A family system that had finally become impossible to inhabit. And they would do the work, genuinely, unflinchingly. They would confront the shadow material, the fury, the sorrow, the fragments of themselves they'd spent decades concealing. They'd sit with the unsettling recognition of how much of their existence had been constructed on foundations that were never authentically theirs. They'd allow relationships to fall away. They'd allow identities to dissolve. They'd endure the terrifying hollowness that arrives after you've removed everything false and haven't yet assembled anything true. And then they'd reach a peculiar place. A place where the old life was unmistakably finished. They could feel that in their bones. But the new life hadn't commenced. They were occupying the gap, the in-between. And Jung noticed that people could inhabit this gap for months, sometimes years, sometimes for the remainder of their lives. They described it with near identical language, almost phrase for phrase. I've completed the work. I understand who I am now. I recognize my patterns. I've released what needed releasing. So why does my existence still look like this? Why am I still standing here? It wasn't a deficiency of effort. Jung perceived that the gap wasn't a deficiency of effort. These individuals had labored on themselves more rigorously than most humans ever would. The gap was a deficiency of permission. Something within them, something ancient, something pre-verbal, something installed long before they possessed language to interrogate it, was refusing to allow them to receive what they'd cleared space for. This is where Jung's message originates. He discovered that the people suspended at the threshold almost universally shared a specific psychological architecture. Somewhere in childhood, they had absorbed a lesson, not through words typically, but through the texture of ordinary daily life. That abundance was hazardous. That possessing too much invited consequences. That visible joy made you a target. That if life became too generous, something devastating would arrive to restore the balance. This wasn't superstition, though it frequently wore superstition's exterior. It was survival programming. The child who got excited about something and watched it be taken away. The child who expressed happiness and saw a parent's face darken with envy or resentment. The child who learned that the safest emotional position was marginally below okay, because okay was manageable, but good was exposed. Good meant you had something to lose. Good meant someone might notice and decide you didn't deserve it. The ancient instruction. Jung witnessed this pattern repeat with unsettling regularity. The adults who couldn't advance into expansive lives weren't deficient in courage, clarity, or readiness. They were honoring an ancient instruction their nervous system had never revised. The instruction said, stay compressed, stay guarded, stay just uncomfortable enough that you don't attract notice, because notice in your original environment signified danger. This is worth sitting with, because most people who carry this architecture don't realize they carry it. They believe they desire abundance. They visualize it, strategize toward it, labor in its direction. But their body holds a different agenda. Their nervous system learned decades ago that expansion equals threat. So every time they approach the threshold of a genuinely rich life, their system activates the original protocol. Anxiety materializes from nowhere. Self-defeat engages with surgical accuracy. They provoke a conflict, miss a deadline, become ill at precisely the wrong moment, make the one choice that draws them back from the edge, and then they condemn themselves. They conclude they're damaged, undisciplined, constitutionally incapable of sustaining good things. But Jung would offer something entirely different. He'd say, your system is operating perfectly. It's shielding you from what it still believes is dangerous. The difficulty is that it's shielding you from a threat that no longer exists, using a map of reality drawn when you were 5 years old. The first layer, misplaced loyalty. Your arrest at the threshold is loyalty. Loyalty to an antiquated understanding of safety. Loyalty to a version of reality where staying compressed preserved you. And that loyalty was once entirely rational. It was, in truth, a child's genius-level adaptation to an environment where visibility was penalized. But you are no longer in that environment. And the loyalty that once preserved you is now the precise force preventing you from the life you've already earned the right to inhabit. The second layer, the deeper terror. Jung descended further. He uncovered a second layer that was more difficult to face. The people suspended at the threshold weren't merely afraid of external penalty for having a rich life. They were afraid of who they would become if they actually stepped into one. Because stepping into genuine abundance, the kind that encompasses emotional richness, creative expression, authentic intimacy, material ease, psychological liberation, requires becoming someone their original family system would not recognize. And that, Jung discovered, was the deeper terror. The sense that fully inhabiting an expansive life meant completing a separation that part of them was still refusing to finalize. The ultimate, irreversible separation from the world they originated from. Jung called this the individuation threshold. The point at which becoming yourself and belonging to your origin can no longer coexist. Where the person you're becoming and the system that shaped you diverge so completely that stepping forward means accepting you can never fully return. You can visit. You can cherish the people there, but you cannot reside in that world anymore, because you have exceeded its dimensions. And some fragment of you, a loyal, grief-laden, exhausted fragment, has been standing at the threshold, declining to complete that separation. The grief no one talks about. This is not about cutting people from your life. Jung was explicit about that. Individuation isn't a rejection of where you originated. It is the completion of a psychological birth that commenced when you first began questioning the inherited story about who you were designated to be. You've been in labor with yourself for years. The birth is ready to conclude. But completing it means being fully, irrevocably born into your own existence. And that carries a grief that most transformation frameworks entirely bypass. Because here is what no one communicates about stepping into an expansive life. You will grieve. You'll mourn the simplicity of the former world, even if that world was painful. You'll grieve the version of yourself who fit there. You'll grieve the relationships that cannot accompany you. You'll grieve the comfort of compression because smallness, for all its suffering, was familiar. And familiar exerts a gravitational pull that abundance doesn't, particularly when your nervous system was calibrated in scarcity. Jung didn't perceive this grief as a complication. He saw it as the cost of entry. The threshold to a rich life passes through grief the way a river passes through a gorge. There is no route around it, only through. And the people who remained suspended at the threshold were frequently the ones who sensed this grief waiting and unconsciously elected to remain in the gap rather than feel it. But here's what Jung also found. The grief is finite. It has a floor. It has a conclusion. People who permitted themselves to feel it, who stopped fleeing from the sorrow of outgrowing their origins, moved through it with unexpected velocity. Weeks, sometimes a few months of authentic mourning for the world they were relinquishing. And then something opened. What opened was capacity, psychological capacity for receiving what had always been present but couldn't land, like a harbor blocked by accumulated debris. Once the grief cleared the channel, life could actually arrive. Opportunities that had been orbiting began to settle. Relationships that resonated with the new frequency materialized. Creative energy that had been conscripted into the service of staying compressed, redirected into building something genuine. The richness they had been approaching for years could finally reach them, because they had stopped unconsciously obstructing it. Where Jung's message sharpens. Here's what Jung would tell you, as closely as it can be rendered in plain language. You have been confusing preparation with arrival. You've been doing the interior work, accumulating clarity, developing awareness, and operating under the assumption that at some point the work itself would deliver you into the rich life. As if sufficient shadow integration would automatically generate abundance. As if enough interior excavation would eventually produce the existence you envision, without you having to do something that feels fundamentally unlike everything you've done so far. The work was necessary, every fragment of it. You needed to dismantle the counterfeit structures, confront the shadow, grieve the former identity, comprehend your patterns. All of that prepared the ground. But preparing ground and building upon it are distinct acts. And the second act requires something the first act doesn't. A willingness to receive without having justified that reception through additional suffering. This is where it becomes uncomfortable for people who have built their identity around doing the difficult work. Because at a certain point, the difficult work transforms into its own form of avoidance. If you are perpetually processing, perpetually healing, perpetually entering the next phase of interior transformation, you never have to encounter the terrifying simplicity of simply allowing good things. Allowing ease. Allowing an existence that isn't organized around your wound. Jung witnessed this constantly. Individuals who had become so identified with the journey of healing that healing itself became the enclosure. They knew how to suffer productively. They knew how to confront difficult truths. They knew how to occupy discomfort. What they didn't know, what their entire system resisted, was how to inhabit genuine goodness without anticipating the counterblow. Jung's message, the one he'd delivered directly. If you had seated yourself across from him in that study in Küsnacht, the lake visible through the window, books stacked in every direction, and told him you'd completed the work but couldn't cross the threshold, here is what he would have said. You are not waiting for readiness. You are ready. You have been ready. What you are waiting for is a guarantee that the rich life won't be taken from you the way good things were extracted from you before, and that assurance will never arrive. It cannot arrive because existence doesn't extend guarantees of permanence. What life offers, What the self offers, if you'll allow it, is the experience of fullness. Right now, today, in this body, with these resources, alongside these people, in this imperfect and transient and astonishing window of being alive. The rich life you've been approaching isn't a compensation for sufficient suffering. It isn't something you secure by completing one additional phase of healing. It's something you allow by making a decision your nervous system has been declining to make. The decision that you are permitted to have this. That joy is survivable. That abundance is endurable. That your existence is authorized to be good, without catastrophe arriving close behind. What crossing the threshold actually looks like. Jung observed people make this decision. It rarely appeared dramatic from the exterior. Sometimes it was a person finally accepting a relationship their body had been screening out. Sometimes it was someone establishing different terms for their work, or relocating to the city they'd been imagining, or simply ceasing the relentless self-refinement long enough to inhabit what they'd already constructed. The external expression varied endlessly, but the internal shift was invariably the same. A moment where the old loyalty to compression released its grip, and the person stepped forward into a life their childhood self would have found unimaginable. And here is what transpired afterward. Jung documented this with care because it mattered to him. The people who crossed the threshold didn't become different people. They became more themselves. The qualities that had been compressed by years of survival, their humor, their creativity, their warmth, their intensity, their singular way of perceiving the world, expanded to occupy the space that fear had been inhabiting. They didn't become spiritual ideals or enlightened archetypes. They became vivid, particular, fully inhabited human beings. Humans who laughed more than they anticipated, who built things that surprised them, who attracted circumstances and people that resonated with the frequency they'd been too apprehensive to broadcast. What the rich life actually means. The richness Jung was describing was never primarily financial. Though material ease was frequently part of it, the richness was experiential, sensory, relational, creative. It was the richness of waking within a life that actually accommodates you, where your daily existence reflects your interior reality rather than contradicting it, where you don't spend every evening recovering from a day that violated your values, where the people surrounding you actually perceive you, and you don't have to perform a version of yourself to sustain the connection. That is the rich life, and it has been waiting for you to stop believing you need one additional breakthrough before you deserve it. Fair warning, the first weeks feel wrong. Jung would caution you here because he was honest in that way. The initial weeks of a rich life feel incorrect. Your nervous system, calibrated for struggle, will interpret ease as threat. You'll feel anxious when circumstances improve. You'll search for the concealed danger in favorable developments. You'll notice yourself generating complications because complications are familiar and you understand how to navigate them. While genuine contentment is uncharted territory that makes you feel exposed. This is ordinary. It is the nervous system catching up with the psychological shift you've already made. And the only passage through it is repetition. Repeated encounters with good things that don't terminate in penalty. Repeated moments of ease that don't collapse into catastrophe. Repeated evidence, accumulating slowly, that your body can eventually accept what your mind already comprehends. That you are permitted to be here, in the rich life, inhabiting it each day. Jung compared this to a plant that has been growing in a darkened room, suddenly positioned in sunlight. The plant doesn't immediately flourish. It falters slightly at first. The intensity of what it has been reaching toward its entire existence is initially overwhelming. But the plant doesn't need to return to the dark room. It needs to remain in the light long enough for its biology to recalibrate. And then it doesn't simply recover. It becomes what it was always constituted to become. You have been in the dark room. You have performed the extraordinary, solitary, frequently brutal labor of growing in conditions that weren't designed for your flourishing. And now, the light is accessible. The door is open. The rich life is immediately present, and every cell in your body that learned to associate darkness with safety is instructing you to hesitate, to wait, to verify, to complete one additional cycle of preparation. Jung's message: cease preparing, begin living. The readiness you are waiting to feel is something that only develops after you have stepped through the door. Never before. You don't feel ready and then move. You move and then discover you were ready the entire time. Every person Jung observed cross this threshold communicated the same reflection afterward. I could have done this earlier. And he would acknowledge that quietly, because he had been telling them all along. One final element, the most consequential. Jung recognized that stepping into a rich life is, at its foundation, an act of psychological faith. Trust in the self, in the deeper organizing intelligence of your own psyche, which has been navigating you through every dark passage and every painful dismantling towards something you couldn't perceive while you were inside it. The shadow work, the grief, the identity dissolutions, the relationships that concluded, the ground that evaporated beneath you. All of it was preparation for this. All of it was creating space for a life that required more room than your former structures could provide. Jung called this trusting the individuation process, trusting that the intelligence propelling your transformation understands where it's conducting you, even when you cannot perceive the destination from where you stand. You trusted it through the demanding passages, through the nights you weren't certain you'd survive, through the losses that felt insurmountable, through the phases where you couldn't recognize yourself in the mirror. You trusted it then. Trust it now. Trust it into the good, because the good is where the process has been conducting you all along. The dismantling was never the destination. The destination was always what could be constructed once the counterfeit structures were removed. Jung's message, distilled. You have permission. You have possessed it longer than you recognize. The universe, or the self, or whatever name feels authentic to you, is not maintaining a ledger. It is not waiting for you to accumulate sufficient suffering before releasing you into joy. The door has been open. You have been standing before it with your hand on the frame, telling yourself you need one additional thing before you can pass through. You don't need one additional thing. You need only this, to walk through, into the complete, textured, imperfect, abundant, breathing life that has been assembling itself during your interior work. It will feel unfamiliar at first. It will feel excessively good. Your body will resist it. Your original programming will manufacture doubt. And there will be moments when you want to retreat to the familiar territory of working on yourself. Because at least that felt purposeful. At least that had structure. At least you knew the rules. Stay regardless. Remain in the new life. Allow your nervous system to recalibrate. Allow the unfamiliar to become familiar. Allow ease to cease feeling dangerous. Allow people to love you without anticipating abandonment. Allow material flow without tensing for scarcity. Allow creativity to move through you without judging every expression. Allow your days to be shaped by desire rather than obligation, by genuine curiosity rather than survival, by the authentic interests of the person you have become, rather than the desperate requirements of the person you once were. The person you were when this all began. Think about them for a moment. Not the version of you sitting here now, with all the clarity, the hard-won self-knowledge, the quiet confidence that comes from having survived things you weren't sure you'd survive. The earlier version, the one who first felt something was wrong, not with the world exactly, but with the fit. The way a life can look completely acceptable from the outside and feel like wearing someone else's clothes every single day. That person started something without a map, without a guarantee, without anyone telling them the path through the shadow was going to be worth what it cost. They just knew, somewhere below language, that staying asleep was no longer an option. And so they began. Every difficult conversation, every identity outgrown and grieved, every night spent sitting with something painful rather than running from it, every relationship that couldn't survive your becoming. That was not suffering for its own sake. That was construction. You were building the interior architecture of a person capable of holding a genuinely rich life, without flinching, without sabotaging it, without unconsciously dismantling it the moment it started to feel real. That person is you now. The final stage of becoming here is what Jung understood that most people never quite let themselves believe. The transformation doesn't end at the threshold. It completes itself on the other side. The final stage of becoming isn't another descent into shadow. It isn't more grief, more excavation, more nights of productive suffering. It is the living, the actual inhabiting of the life the work was always pointing toward. You were never meant to spend your whole existence in the process of becoming. At some point, becoming yields to being. And being, simply, fully, unapologetically being the person you've worked so hard to become, is not a reward you receive after one more breakthrough. It is a choice you make in an ordinary moment, on an ordinary day, when nothing feels dramatically different, but everything quietly is. Jung watched people make that choice. He watched them step forward into lives that felt too good to be safe, and then slowly, through accumulated experience, discover that good was something their nervous system could learn to trust. He watched ease become familiar. He watched joy lose its threat. He watched people who had spent years waiting for the other shoe to drop gradually realize that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and more often, the shoe simply doesn't drop. Sometimes good things stay. Sometimes the life you've built holds. Yours will hold. Not because life is without difficulty. Jung never promised that. But because you have become someone who can navigate difficulty without being destroyed by it. Someone who can return to themselves after being shaken. Someone who has proven, through years of interior labor, that they are not fragile in the ways they once feared. You are not fragile. You are the most resilient version of yourself that has ever existed. Jung's final message. The rich life, the one with actual texture and weight, where your days reflect your values and your relationships reflect your worth and your work reflects your genuine nature, that life is not waiting for a better version of you. It is waiting for you to stop waiting. This is not a technique, not a framework, just a truth delivered from a man who spent his life watching humans stand at the edge of their own becoming. You have already become. Now live. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung.